Right, the purpose of this screencast is twofold. First, I'm going to read pages 171 to 174 in the Northern Lights textbook. I'm also going to preview that reading quickly before we get started, and then I'm going to show you how to take notes on some of the reading. The rest of it you'll either be doing as a whole class, a small group, and then as an individual. So to preview this, we're going to use paths. We'll start with pictures. We have a traditional hunting bag here. We have this picture, which is what are called farm Dakota, meaning these men are wearing, and the boy are wearing what whites would wear. They're living in a home that whites would live in, but also you see the skeleton of a teepee, and the Dakota women are wearing more traditional clothing. So there's a mixture of cultures. Another picture that we see is of a trader whose name is going to pop up and you will hear about, named Andrew Myrick. And so his name will come up because he said some pretty horrible things. But the Dakota got their revenge. Looking at headings, setting the stage at the Lower Sioux Agency. So we have this thing called the Lower Sioux Agency, which you can see in this map here. We have the Lower Sioux Agency, which is right here on the Minnesota River, and then the Upper Sioux Agency, which is here along the Minnesota River. And this is the Dakota Reservation, and you can see it's been divided in two. So the northern part is in this light pink, and then there's the dark red. Perhaps that serves a purpose to our reading. Other titles I see, traditional Dakota, and then that term is defined. So something about traditional Dakota, farm Dakota, that term is defined. We're also going to talk about government workers, traders, and missionaries. These 5 groups were all stakeholders, meaning they had a stake in what was happening in Minnesota and their participation would either lead up to the U.S.-Dakota War or they would be impacted by the U.S.-Dakota War. So when I look at the note-taking form you're going to use today, it's called stakeholders. And your learning is students will be able to describe the needs and wants of various stakeholders participating in and or impacted by the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862. When you take notes, you're just going to take notes on 3 main things that pop into your head after you've done the reading, and then you're going to be telling us what did this particular group want and why. And you're going to see a lot of what they wanted conflicted with each other. So this is the note-taking form on stakeholders. So let's get started with the reading. Page 171 in the Northern Lights textbook. Setting the stage at the Lower Sioux Agency. The Dakota's reservation along the Minnesota River was split into 2 areas, each with its own government field office or agency. The Upper Sioux Agency was close to the confluence or meeting of the Yellow Medicine River and the Minnesota River. The Lower Sioux Agency was near the confluence of the Minnesota and Redwood Rivers. Those are those 2 upper and lower agencies we looked at earlier. The U.S. government used Sioux rather than Dakota in their agency names. And if you remember, Sioux was a term coming from the Ojibwe. It's what the Ojibwe called the Dakota. By 1862, both agencies had grown into small towns. The town at the Lower Sioux Agency was a especially busy place with homes, mills, warehouses, stores, a stable, a steamboat landing, and a schoolhouse. So back to our map, we're talking about this Lower Sioux Agency here along the Minnesota River. European American traders and government workers filled the town at the Lower Sioux Agency. The Dakota lived on the surrounding reservation land. The culture and perspectives of these 2 groups were very different. These differences led to a tragic conflict. And I look here, agency, a U.S. government field office. So government officials are at this agency. On to traditional Dakota, which I will be taking notes on after I read this. So I like to read it first, and then what sticks in my head I take notes on. So term, traditional Dakota. Dakota who wanted to maintain their culture and resist efforts to make them live like European Americans. In the summer of 1862, many Dakota at the Lower Agency lived in villages with teepees and bark lodges along the south side of the Minnesota River. So looking at this, they're living in this dark red area along the south side, close to these agencies. Each village was led by a respected leader, such as Little Crow V or Tayota Dute, Blue Earth or Makato, which we get close to Mankato, and then Red Banner or Wapasha, which Wabasha comes from. Families in these villages wanted to continue their traditional ways of life. They were traditional Dakota. They kept their sacred rituals and beliefs, even though the missionaries tried to convert them to Christianity. Men and women often traveled off the reservations to hunt game and gather food. So now I turn to my note-taking form, where I'm going to be taking notes, and 3 things that stick into my head. The first thing, looking back at the reading, is this idea that they lived where they lived, and it was along the south side of the Minnesota River. So, traditional Dakota lived along the south side of the MN River. Notice I'm using shorthand in some places so that I'm not writing everything. I'm just taking it in note-taking form. Another important thing that I read is families in these villages wanted to continue their traditional way of life. Now that might be a want. So we'll see, they kept their sacred rituals and beliefs. So I'm going to write that here. Traditional Dakota kept their rituals and beliefs, resisted conversion from missionaries. And if you remember, missionaries are people sent by churches to convert people. Then we have to take a final note. And looking back at the reading, and notice I'm reviewing the reading to take the notes, so I go back to it after reading it. Men and women often traveled off the reservations to hunt game and gather food. This is important. So, hunted off reservation. And then I want to switch these two because they're out of order. Okay, so now I have my 3 notes and then my want. And I can just remember this is traditional Dakota wanted to live like their people had for thousands of years. That's their want. So I got my traditional Dakota notes taken. Back to the reading. We have Farm Dakota. By 1862, several hundred Dakota on the reservation were living on farms away from the traditional villages. These farm Dakota grew crops, raised livestock, and lived in wood or brick houses along the main road that cut through the reservation. Most of them, including the Dakota leader Wounded Man, or Tyopi, abandoned some traditional Dakota customs and adapted to European American way of life. The farm Dakota wore American-style clothing, and many attended the missionaries' churches. The Dakota were pressured to look as much like European Americans as possible. Men were to cut their hair short, and women were to wear theirs pinned up on their heads. So when I look at the term farm Dakota, Dakota who adopted some European American ways including farming like settlers. At this point, you're going to want to pause and you're going to take notes, Farm Dakota, and we're going to do this as a whole group. So we'll pause now. Government workers. In 1862, the top government official at both the Upper and Lower Sioux agencies was the Indian agent Thomas Galbraith. He was the person responsible for carrying out the U.S. government's assimilation policies on the reservations. These policies were designed to make the Dakota change their traditional lifestyle and adopt European American practices. Many believed the Dakota needed to assimilate in order to survive. The agent oversaw a number of government workers, including blacksmiths, carpenters, and a doctor. Many of these people lived and worked in buildings surrounding each agency's headquarters. The agent also handed out the food and money that the U.S. government had promised the Dakota under the treaties of 1851 and 1858. What's interesting about the government workers is what they wanted to do with the Dakota. That was their want. So, you're going to pause now, and you're actually going to be taking notes here under government workers, and you're going to be doing this as a small group. Traders. The government allowed a small group of traders, including one named Andrew Myrick, to run stores where the Dakota could buy additional food and supplies. The traders usually worked on a credit system similar to the one used during the fur trade decades earlier. Traders provided goods to the Dakota and expected them to pay their debts when they received their annuities. The traders kept written records of every business deal they made. The Dakota did not. Some Dakota indicated they did not trust all the traders. This added to tension on the reservation. So, in taking notes on this, you're now taking notes on the traders and describing them, and then what did they want and why. And you're going to pause now and take that as an individual. Missionaries, our final stakeholder. A few settlers in the area were missionaries. Their goal was to convince the Dakota to give up their spiritual traditions and accept Christianity. Missionaries lived among the Dakota. Many learned their language. They got to know many Dakota well and often spoke up for them during disputes with traders and the Indian agent. By 1862, two missionaries, Samuel Heineman and John Williamson, had founded churches near the Lower Sioux Agency. They believed the only way the Dakota to survive, they believed the only way for the Dakota to survive was to adapt to their new situation. The U.S. government's policies toward the Dakota supported this goal. So for this, as an individual, you will take notes here and tell what the missionaries wanted and why. You can pause and do that as an individual. This concludes the screencast.